Before we begin, take a moment to breathe. If these reflections speak to something silent inside you, subscribe so you don't lose the path back here. Every like, every comment helps this message find those who are still searching in the dark. Now, let's begin. Jung's most unsettling discovery was never about empathy in its ordinary form. It arose from a far more dangerous intersection, when empathic sensitivity converged with the strategic, visionary cognition found most commonly in INTJ and INFJ minds. He observed that this rare psychological fusion did not produce the gentle, receptive empath most people imagine. It produced something else entirely. An individual capable of perceiving, decoding, and influencing the inner architecture of another person's psyche, with a precision that defied anything Jung had previously encountered. Jung called these individuals strategic empaths, not because they manipulated emotion intentionally, but because their minds naturally operated like instruments designed for psychological analysis. They did not merely absorb feelings. They mapped them, traced them, interpreted them. To Jung, this was both extraordinary and profoundly dangerous. He eventually referred to their unique talent as architectural empathy, the capacity to perceive the full emotional blueprint of a human being as if looking through transparent glass, and, if they wished, to reshape that structure through precisely chosen interventions. They possessed the power to heal or to manipulate, not by force but by understanding. This, Jung warned, is what made them the most potent and potentially destructive psychological type he had ever seen. He believed that individuals who carried this combination would face one of two destinies: psychological collapse or the emergence of what he termed the sovereign empath, a consciousness capable of holding immense power without being consumed by it. The case that first revealed this phenomenon arrived in 1932. Jung wrote about it privately, never publishing the full details. The man he referred to only as Dr. K was a psychiatrist of exceptional intellect who sought Jung's guidance not because he was mentally ill, but because he felt cursed by what he described as the burden of omniscience. Jung initially dismissed the phrase as metaphor, a dramatic expression of professional exhaustion, but he soon realized Dr. K was describing something literal. This man possessed a sensitivity to psychological pattern that exceeded anything Jung had witnessed. He combined empathic depth with the strategic, anticipatory thinking characteristic of an INTJ mind. In the early sessions, Jung noticed something uncanny. Dr. K did not simply intuit what his patients felt. He could predict their behavior with startling accuracy. He would describe with clinical detachment the precise emotional sequence that would unfold in a patient's mind hours or days later. Jung tested him. The predictions were not guesses. They were correct with such consistency that Jung began recording them. The result, a 94% accuracy. Jung realized this was not intuition, nor was it telepathy. It was an entirely new psychological mechanism. Dr. K possessed the ability Jung would later define as psychological architecture reading, the capacity to perceive the scaffolding of a person's inner world, their defensive structures, their primary wounds, their emotional reflexes, and the precise triggers capable of producing specific responses. What disturbed Jung most was not the ability itself, but the moral neutrality of it. This man could see exactly how to comfort someone or how to break them. During one session, Dr. K demonstrated the extent of his perception. He told Jung what Jung was feeling, a feeling Jung had not expressed aloud. He explained why Jung felt it, citing childhood experiences that Jung had never shared with him. He then predicted Jung's next 3 therapeutic questions before Jung had consciously formed them. Jung later wrote in his private notebook, "I experienced the unsettling sensation of having my own psychological anatomy displayed before me by someone who understood its structure more thoroughly than I did myself." This was the moment Jung recognized that Dr. K did not simply analyze emotion. He entered it, moved through it, read its internal geometry. But what horrified Jung was how effortlessly Dr. K could have used this insight for manipulation. Dr. K confessed openly, not with pride but with resignation, that he could make a patient fall in love with him if he wished. He could create trust where none existed. He could shift a person's belief system by mirroring their unmet needs in carefully timed doses. Jung realized something chilling. He was not speaking to an unusually gifted empath. He was speaking to an entirely new category of psychological consciousness. It was here that Jung formulated the foundation of what he would later call the empathic architecture system, a 3-part mechanism unique to INTJ and INFJ empaths, a system that made them capable of extraordinary insight and equally extraordinary harm. Part 1. Pattern-based empathy. Jung wrote that most empaths feel what others feel, but INTJ and INFJ empaths do something different, something far rarer and infinitely more dangerous. They see emotion. They recognize psychological patterns with the same clarity an architect sees the load-bearing beams of a cathedral. Their empathy is not a wave of shared emotion. It is a map. Jung traced this phenomenon to their dominant function, introverted intuition. He observed that their minds naturally follow emotional responses backwards toward their origin point, like tracing water to its spring. They don't simply feel your sadness. They see the childhood wound that created it, the pattern of relationships that reinforced it, and the exact phrase that would intensify it or bring it to peace. This is why Jung considered them strategic empaths. Their sensitivity is not passive. It is analytical. It is predictive. It is structural. Part 2. Strategic Emotional Modeling. Jung documented that these rare empaths construct psychological models of those around them, instantly and unconsciously. While typical empaths absorb emotional waves, these empaths study the tide, its rhythm, its origin, its predictability. He wrote, "They assemble within minutes a psychological portrait that would take a seasoned clinician months to construct. Their mind catalogs everything. The tone someone uses to mask insecurity, the micro-expression that betrays resentment, the hesitation that reveals loyalty, the repeated emotional reflex that exposes an old wound. None of this is intentional. It is simply how their consciousness processes reality." And then comes the third mechanism, the part Jung feared the most. Part 3. Conscious implementation. Most empaths drown in emotion. They feel deeply but lack strategy. INTJ and INFJ empaths are different. They can feel and observe at the same time. They maintain emotional distance while understanding someone with surgical precision. This is the foundation of what Jung called empathic omniscience, the ability to perceive another person's internal mechanisms without losing oneself in the process. From here, Jung wrote, arises the possibility of immense healing or immense destruction, because these empaths can de-escalate conflict in seconds, evoke trust instantly, speak to a person's hidden wound without naming it, calm a mind in panic, destabilize a manipulator with one sentence, reflect back a person's deepest longing with uncanny accuracy, or, if they choose, trigger emotional implosion with a single well-timed remark, not because they want to manipulate, but because they know how emotional architecture responds. To Jung, this was the razor's edge between the sovereign empath and the shadow architect, the brain behind the ability. Jung believed the neurological basis was rooted in the rare combination of intuitive cognition and empathic processing. Introverted intuition gives these individuals panoramic insight into human patterns. Extroverted feeling or thinking allows them to translate those insights into relational influence. He famously wrote in a private letter, "Such a person does not simply see the world, they see through it. They observe the architecture of the soul as one observes the design of a great hall from a balcony." Weaponized compassion. This is where Jung introduced one of the most unsettling phrases in his entire body of work. Weaponized compassion. Not because these individuals intend to harm, but because compassion in their hands is precision-guided. A comforting sentence becomes a psychological intervention. A moment of silence becomes a mirror reflecting someone's truth. A single raised eyebrow can expose a liar's fear or confirm an honest heart. Jung warned that with enough self-awareness, these empaths could become extraordinary healers, but without it, they could become architects of emotional dependency so subtle neither the empath nor the other recognizes the prison being built. The transparency effect. Jung discovered another consequence, and perhaps the strangest of all. People feared these empaths without knowing why. Not consciously, not intellectually, but instinctively. He called this phenomenon the transparency effect. Human beings rely on psychological opacity to feel comfortable. We depend on the assumption that others do not see too deeply into our private inner world. But INTJ and INFJ empaths violate this unspoken contract simply by existing. People sense often immediately that their defenses are transparent. Their inner contradictions are visible. Their emotional disguises are ineffective. Jung noticed that even kind, gentle versions of these empaths triggered a primitive fear response. Subjects reported feeling exposed, too visible, or emotionally naked around them. Not because the empath was invasive, but because their perception was too precise. Prediction anxiety. Jung documented that people often felt a strange anxiety in the presence of these empaths. The fear that the empath already knew what they would think or feel next. He called this prediction anxiety. People unconsciously recoil from anyone who threatens their illusion of psychological autonomy. This is why these empaths often hear, "You're too intense. You see too much. I feel like you know me better than I know myself. I don't know why, but I can't lie to you." Or conversely, "I feel judged, even when you say nothing." Two types of people reacted strongly. 1. Those with personality disorders, who sensed without understanding that the empath could perceive their hidden motives. 2. Those with unresolved trauma, who felt seen in ways they were not ready for. Jung wrote, "They carry the curse of perceiving the truth before others are prepared to speak it." and this, he noted, creates isolation. The irony of their gift. Jung saw the greatest paradox. The very gift that could heal others often condemned these empaths to profound loneliness. People either feared them, idolized them, or depended on them, rarely meeting them as equals. Jung called this the observer's prison, a state in which the empath sees everyone clearly but is never fully seen in return. This marks the beginning of the four pathways. The four divergent paths of the INTJ-INFJ empath. Jung discovered that once this rare psychological architecture emerges, its development does not follow a single trajectory. It fractures into four radically different evolutionary paths, four destinies, four psychic fates. Each path produces a different type of empath, and the difference between them is not ability but consciousness. Path 1, the overwhelmed oracle. Jung described the first group as individuals crushed beneath the weight of their own perception. They see too much, too quickly, too deeply. Their insight is not a tool, it is an avalanche. These empaths perceive the psychological future long before it arrives. They watch people's emotional collapses forming like distant storms on the horizon. They sense betrayals months before they occur. They predict relational fractures with eerie accuracy. But because they cannot ignore what they see, they live in a state of unbearable emotional tension, responsible in their minds for outcomes they did not choose yet feel obligated to prevent. Jung wrote, "They become burdened with prophetic agony, watching the psyche unfold yet powerless to redirect its movement without intervening in ways that violate their own nature. Many retreat. Some into solitude, some into depression, some into emotional numbness as a defense against perpetual psychic flooding. Their power becomes their torment." Path 2, the benevolent manipulator. The second path is deceptively bright. These empaths begin to understand that their insights can shift human behavior, not through force but through precision. They say the right words at the right time. They ask questions that unknot the heart. They become counselors, confidants, guides. But Jung noticed a subtle corruption. Their identity becomes intertwined with being needed. They soothe because it grants purpose. They advise because it ensures relevance. They solve others' emotional puzzles because doing so provides meaning. They do not consciously manipulate, but they shape the emotional landscape around them in ways that gently bind others into dependence. Jung called this the shadow of the healer, when the desire to help quietly becomes a desire to be indispensable. Path 3, the shadow architect. Here lies Jung's darkest category. These empaths recognize their power fully, consciously, deliberately, and choose to wield it for personal gain. They read psychological defenses the way a tactician reads battle lines. They exploit wounds the way a strategist exploits weaknesses. They influence emotional outcomes with an artistry that borders on supernatural. Jung wrote, "They construct emotional realities that serve their will, while maintaining the appearance of benevolence." These individuals become what Jung termed psychological sovereigns without conscience. They can build emotional dependence, dismantle confidence, create loyalty or adoration, destabilize rivals, steer relationships, engineer outcomes, shape identity in others. Not through violence, but through insight. They do not dominate outwardly. They colonize inwardly. Jung categorized them as architects of psychological entrapment, the most dangerous manifestation of empathic architecture. Path 4, the sovereign empath. And then, the rarest development of all, the sovereign empath. Jung described them as individuals who integrate their abilities with profound ethical consciousness. They perceive psychological architecture clearly, completely, effortlessly, yet refuse to manipulate it. They choose restraint over control, wisdom over dominance, understanding over influence. Their insight becomes a compass rather than a weapon. Jung wrote, "They become guardians of the soul, not its engineers. They intervene only when the other seeks illumination. They guide without shaping. They see without intruding." The sovereign empath recognizes clarity is not permission, perception is not ownership, insight is not authority, and knowing someone deeply does not entitle them to shape that person's path. This, Jung believed, was the highest psychological development possible for any empathic type. But reaching this level requires navigating the dangers of the INTJ-INFJ empathic configuration. Dangers Jung considered so severe he questioned whether this type should exist at all. The dangers Jung considered psychologically volcanic. Jung identified multiple internal threats capable of destroying these empaths long before they reach sovereignty. Danger 1: the God complex drift. When someone can see others so clearly, their wounds, their patterns, their contradictions, it becomes dangerously easy to believe they know what is best. Jung observed that many empaths begin with noble intentions only to slip gradually into paternalistic control. They guide too much, shape too much, intervene too quickly. They impose their vision of healing onto others' paths. What begins as compassion becomes quiet tyranny. Danger 2: the isolation paradox. These empaths crave deep connection yet are isolated by the variability that could create it. People either fear their insight, depend on it, idealize it, or resent it. Few can meet them as equals. Jung called this the observer's solitude, a psychological exile where one sees everyone and is seen by no one. Danger 3: the responsibility burden. Because they sense emotional outcomes long before others do, they carry a crushing inner weight. Jung named this prophetic guilt. They feel responsible for suffering they foresaw but could not prevent, without intruding on someone's free development. Danger 4: the authenticity erosion. Perhaps the gravest danger. These empaths become so attuned to others that their own emotional truth dissolves. They feel through others instead of themselves. They respond to the emotional field instead of their inner voice. Jung called this empathic dissociation, a state where the individual is connected to everyone except themselves. Danger 5: the control addiction. Insight becomes influence, influence becomes stability. Stability becomes safety, safety becomes control. Soon they are manipulating outcomes not out of malice but out of fear of emotional unpredictability. To Jung, this was the final temptation. The desire to predict because unpredictability threatens their inner equilibrium. But Jung insisted that each of these dangers could be transformed through conscious integration. Thus he developed the next stage of the rare empath's evolution, the architectural empathy integration protocol. The architectural empathy integration protocol, Jung's method for preventing corruption of insight. Jung understood that this rare form of empathy was not inherently benevolent, nor inherently dangerous, but inherently volatile. Without integration, it destabilizes the psyche as surely as fire consumes oxygen. With integration, it becomes one of the most sophisticated forms of human consciousness. To protect individuals with this configuration, Jung developed a four-stage framework designed to transform raw empathic power into conscious, ethical, grounded perception. Stage 1. Recognition of the shadowed motive. Jung insisted that no empath, however gifted, could develop safely until they acknowledge their own capacity for psychological domination. He observed that even the gentlest empaths carried within them an unconscious thrill at being the one who sees. To Jung, this was the root danger, not manipulation itself, but the subtle pride that arises from perceiving others more clearly than they perceive themselves. He instructed these empaths to examine moments when insight made them feel superior, conversations where they intervened not to help but to feel pivotal, situations where guidance concealed the desire to be needed, emotional bonds built on rescue rather than reciprocity, the pleasure of being irreplaceable. Jung wrote, "The shadow of the empath is the hunger to shape the inner life of another, while believing oneself to be selfless. Until this shadow was recognized, true integration was impossible." Stage 2. Boundary architecture. The discipline of chosen perception. Unlike ordinary empaths, INTJ and INFJ empaths do not drown in emotion. Their danger lies in seeing too deeply, too immediately. Jung therefore created a discipline he called conscious permeability, the ability to decide when to perceive and how deeply to enter another's emotional field. He taught them practices such as disengaging perception by grounding attention in physical sensation, refusing to analyze people unless invited, allowing interactions to remain pleasantly superficial, turning off intuitive scanning in social environments, releasing the compulsive need to read someone, resisting the urge to solve unspoken wounds. He described this restraint as the empathic fast, deliberately abstaining from psychological analysis to preserve authentic human connection. Jung warned, "The rare empath must learn when not to see. Without this discipline, their clarity devours intimacy." Stage 3. Construction of an ethical framework, the healer's code. Jung believed the mind with architectural empathy required ethical guidelines far stricter than those needed by any other personality type. He formulated principles including: insight must never be used to direct another's choices. No psychological observation should be shared without consent. Guidance may only be given when explicitly requested. Emotional patterns must not be revealed to gain closeness, loyalty, or advantage. One must refuse the savior role unless the other fully participates. No psychological truth should be imposed before the individual is ready to understand it. The central tenet of the healer's code was simple: insight without invitation is intrusion. Stage 4. Reclamation of the authentic self. Perhaps Jung's most profound discovery was that these empaths often lost themselves in the labyrinths of other people's psyches. Their sensitivity became outward-facing, perpetually attuned to the emotions, needs, expectations, and wounds of everyone around them. To break this pattern, Jung developed a process he called empathic individuation, the inward return. He guided these individuals through extended solitude to reestablish their emotional baseline, creative practices that bypassed analytical thinking, journaling without interpretation, somatic grounding to reconnect with instinct, relationships with people who could see beyond the empathic aura, to the unguarded self beneath. The goal was to restore what Jung feared they would otherwise lose forever: their own interior life. For Jung, this integration protocol was not theoretical, it was essential for survival. Because the next phase of his work revealed that INTJ and INFJ empaths not only perceive but attract psychological complexity. The magnetic field of the rare empath. Jung began noticing that individuals with architectural empathy often found themselves surrounded by fragmented personalities, wounded individuals seeking clarity, emotionally hungry people, manipulators drawn to their insight, narcissists intrigued by their depth, troubled souls seeking refuge, and people unconsciously desiring to be understood at any cost. Jung observed, "They do not seek complexity. Complexity seeks them." He noted several reasons. 1. Their presence activates unconscious material in others. People feel exposed long before they understand why. 2. Their emotional clarity acts like a mirror, forcing others to confront their own contradictions. 3. Their psychological resilience creates an energetic pull for those who have never been understood so comprehensively. 4. Their intuitive depth threatens individuals who rely on persona, pretense, or emotional opacity. This magnetic phenomenon created two challenges: the danger of being pursued by wounded individuals seeking healing, the danger of being targeted by manipulative personalities who feel threatened by transparency. Jung realized this empathic configuration does not merely observe the unconscious, it activates it. And the more integrated the empath becomes, the stronger the activation. This discovery led Jung to outline the 4 relational patterns that determine the fate of every INTJ-INFJ empath. The 4 relational pathways. How the world responds to the INTJ-INFJ empath. Jung discovered that individuals with architectural empathy do not simply move through relationships. They transform them. Every interaction becomes an activation. Every connection a catalyst, every bond a psychological field charged with unconscious material. Because of this, Jung identified 4 distinct relational dynamics that consistently appeared around INTJ and INFJ empaths. Each dynamic reveals not only how others respond to them, but how these empaths mirror the unspoken architecture of the human psyche. Relational pattern 1. The ones who are overwhelmed by being seen. These individuals retreat instinctively. They feel naked under the gaze of the rare empath, not because the empath is invasive, but because their natural perception cuts through the persona with disarming ease. Jung wrote, "Most people live behind a soft veil of self-deception. The rare empath does not tear this veil. They simply see through it, and this alone terrifies the unconscious." To such individuals, the empath's presence feels like standing in a bright room after existing in dimness. They withdraw, become guarded, or sever connection without explanation. Not because they dislike the empath, but because they are not ready to be transparent. Relational pattern 2. The ones who become dependent. These individuals experience the rare empath as a kind of psychological oasis. For the first time, someone sees them fully, their wounds, their longing, their unspoken interior. Jung observed that such people often interpret this clarity as emotional safety. They lean in, they confide, they attach. Soon they begin relying on the empath for guidance, emotional regulation, clarity, decision-making, meaning, identity structure. Their unconscious plea becomes, "Help me become the person I cannot become alone." Jung warned that this dynamic is seductive for the empath as well. It meets their need to serve, to be significant, to use their insight for perceived good. But he cautioned, dependency disguised as devotion is the most subtle form of psychological imprisonment. Relational pattern. 3. The ones who feel threatened. These individuals experience the rare empath's insight as an intrusion, even when no intrusion has occurred. They interpret questions as challenges, empathy as scrutiny, understanding as exposure. Their unconscious fear is simple. What if this person sees what I have hidden from myself? Jung wrote, "Those who fear their own unconscious fear most the person who can perceive it." This fear manifests as hostility, defensiveness, accusations of manipulation, abrupt withdrawal, attempts to assert dominance, projection of negative intent. To Jung, this was not evidence that the empath had done anything wrong. It was evidence that the other person perceived the possibility of being seen too clearly. Relational pattern 4. The ones who are transformed. This is the rarest response. Some individuals experience the presence of the INTJ-INFJ empath as a catalyst for inner evolution. With these people, the empath does not trigger fear or dependency, but recognition. They sense mutual depth, shared symbolic language, comfort with shadow, psychological maturity, authentic curiosity, willingness to evolve. Jung referred to these individuals as conscious companions, the only ones capable of meeting the rare empath as equals. With them, the relationship does not devolve into manipulation, fear, projection, idealization, or dependency. Instead, it becomes what Jung termed a mutual activation of the self. Both individuals evolve. Both individuals expand, both individuals deepen. And here, Jung believed, lies the true purpose of the INTJ-INFJ empath's rare design: to participate in relational experiences where consciousness itself awakens. The evolution of the rare empath, the 5 stages of sovereign integration. After mapping relational dynamics, Jung began documenting the internal transformation these empaths undergo as they mature psychologically. He discovered that their development unfolds in 5 stages, each one a crucible of consciousness. Stage 1, the overwhelm initiation. At first, their perception is uncontrolled, a flood of emotional and intuitive information pouring into them from every direction. They see too much, feel too much, know too much. People mistake them for anxious, withdrawn, or overly sensitive. Jung understood the truth. They are not fragile, they are unfiltered. The crisis of this stage is survival, learning not to drown in the intensity of their own awareness. Stage 2, the power seduction. Once they begin to manage their perception, a new danger emerges. They discover they can influence others easily. A few well-timed insight, a handful of precise observations, and people open up, follow, unravel, or shift direction. This creates a temptation to use insight as leverage. Jung warned that many empaths get stuck here, not out of malice, but out of unconscious ego inflation. To navigate this stage successfully, they must confront their desire to feel indispensable. Stage 3, the ethical crucible. This is the agonizing turning point. The empath must choose between shaping others and liberating them. Jung described this stage as the wrestling of the soul. The empath asks, should I use what I see? Does understanding others deeply grant me the right to guide them? Am I helping them grow or preventing them from facing their own truth? Do I intervene because it is needed or because it fulfills me? This stage breaks the unprepared and tempers the wise. Stage 4, the boundary ascension. Here the empath begins to master the discipline of chosen perception. They no longer absorb everything, analyze automatically, intervene impulsively, offer insight without invitation, use clarity as currency. Instead, they choose. They decide when to read, when to feel, when to step back, when to remain opaque, when to reveal nothing. Jung described this stage as learning to be a participant in life rather than its interpreter. Stage 5, the sovereign integration. This is the final metamorphosis. The empath becomes grounded, self-possessed, spiritually independent, emotionally clear, ethically disciplined, perceptually precise, psychologically whole. They do not abandon their abilities, they refine them. They become what Jung called the sovereign empath, an individual who can see deeply without losing themselves, who can feel profoundly without collapsing, who can understand without controlling. To Jung, this was the highest expression of human psychological potential. But he also warned that the rare empath faces existential dangers even at this stage. The 5 traps that can destroy even the most developed empath. Jung meticulously cataloged the internal pitfalls that threaten the rare empath's stability. The savior trap. Believing it is their role to rescue others from themselves. Jung warned, to save someone from their path is to steal their destiny. The superiority trap. Mistaking clarity for superiority and depth for enlightenment. Jung emphasized, insight is not virtue. The control trap. Using influence to maintain emotional stability or predictability in relationships. This is subtle, often unconscious, and deeply destructive. The dissociation trap. Losing touch with their own emotions while remaining acutely attuned to everyone else's. Jung saw this as the empath's silent collapse. The emptiness trap. Becoming so accustomed to understanding others that they forget how to experience their own inner life. Jung considered this the most tragic failure. To protect against these traps, he designed a lifelong maintenance system for the rare empath, a conscious discipline of self-return, solitude, creativity, ethical clarity, and relational discernment. The relational strategies required for the INTJ-INFJ empath to remain whole. After years studying architectural empaths, Jung reached a critical conclusion. Their psychological safety depends almost entirely on the quality of their relationships. Not the quantity, not the intensity, not even the emotional intimacy, but the psychological architecture of the people they allow into their inner circle. For this reason, Jung outlined 3 categories of relationships. The ones that fracture the rare empath, the ones that drain the rare empath, and the ones that refine the rare empath. Category 1. The relationships that fracture. These are individuals who cannot tolerate transparency. They operate primarily through projection, defensiveness, denial, persona identification, emotional concealment. The rare empath's presence activates their unconscious fear of being seen. Thus, the empath becomes a threat, a mirror, and/or a perceived manipulator. Jung warned that these individuals will inevitably destabilize the empath through sudden withdrawal, irrational accusations, emotional volatility, subconscious hostility. Not because the empath is harmful, but because the person cannot face their own reflection.
Category 2. The relationships that drain.
These individuals do not fear the empath. They depend on them. They experience the rare empath as a source of clarity, emotional grounding, psychological interpretation, validation, meaning, direction. Jung observed that such relationships feel initially fulfilling to the empath because they activate the healer archetype. But over time, they become parasitic. Jung wrote, "The rare empath must learn that being understood deeply is not the same as being loved deeply. These bonds exhaust the empath because the flow of energy is unilateral. There is giving, reflecting, supporting, but no reciprocity." Category 3. The relationships that refine. These are exceedingly rare. They involve individuals who possess psychological maturity, shadow comfort, emotional self-responsibility, curiosity about their own unconscious, the ability to maintain boundaries, and the strength to withstand the empath's depth without retreating. Jung called these relationships mutual vessels of transformation. In them, the rare empath does not shrink, does not contort, does not overfunction, does not predict to feel safe, does not hide their depth, does not carry the emotional weight alone. Instead, both individuals evolve through exchange, clarity, and shared insight. Jung believed that only these relationships allow the rare empath to reach sovereignty without collapse. The consciousness matching principle. Jung identified one rule, one law, one psychological constant for the rare empath. You cannot form a stable bond with someone whose consciousness is threatened by your clarity. Not because you are too much, but because they have not yet developed the inner structure required to withstand their own reflection. Thus, healthy connections require similar depth, similar inner honesty, similar shadow integration, similar psychological courage, similar capacity for introspection. Otherwise, the empath either dims themselves or becomes the emotional parent in the relationship. Jung emphasized, clarity must be met with clarity. Otherwise, one partner will always drown in the other's depth. The traits of people who are safe for the rare empath. Jung outlined 4 traits that signal a psychologically compatible connection. 1. Shadow acceptance. They do not hide from their darker impulses. They can discuss them without shame, defensiveness, or projection. 2. And boundary integrity. They can say no and can accept no without collapsing into guilt or resentment. 2. Self-reflection. They evaluate their own motives before analyzing anyone else's. Emotional sovereignty. They do not rely on others to regulate their internal world. Jung believed that without these qualities, a relationship with the rare empath will always become distorted by projection, dependency, or fear. The communities that sustain the INTJ-INFJ empath. Jung also noted that rare empaths require specific types of social environments in order to remain grounded. He recommended they seek circles of introspective individuals engaged in genuine psychological growth, creative communities where insight is channeled into art, writing, symbolism, or theory, mentorship roles where their clarity is welcomed rather than feared, service-based environments oriented toward collective healing rather than personal validation. He warned them to avoid emotionally unconscious groups, people who romanticize trauma, individuals seeking spiritual shortcuts, environments built on hierarchy or dominance, relationships that demand self-erasure, communities where depth is mocked or minimized. He wrote, "The sovereign empath thrives only in the presence of others who value truth over comfort." The transformation sequence from dangerous to sovereign. Jung observed that the metamorphosis from raw architectural empathy into sovereign consciousness follows 5 predictable thresholds, each with its own psychological test. Threshold 1. The flooding of insight. At this stage, the empath cannot control the amount of psychological data they absorb. The test, not to collapse. Threshold 2. The temptation of power. Here they realize they can influence others almost effortlessly. The test, not to dominate. Threshold 3. The ethical reckoning. Here they confront their own motives, the desire to be right, needed, or indispensable. The test, not to deceive oneself. Threshold 4. The boundary ascension. Here they learn restraint, containment, and the discipline of chosen perception. The test, not to overfunction. Threshold 5. The sovereign integration. Here they reclaim their own emotions and integrate their abilities with humility and purpose. The test, not to lose themselves in the brilliance of their own insight. Jung believed that crossing all 5 thresholds creates a rare psychological type, capable of serving humanity in a way no other type can. But he was equally clear that failure at any threshold can corrupt the empath permanently, which leads to his final, most radical conclusion. Jung's final insight: the INTJ, INFJ empath as an evolutionary development. In the later years of his work, Jung began noticing a pattern that unsettled even him. Architectural empaths, those who combined intuitive depth with strategic cognition, were appearing more frequently than statistical chance would allow. They were not anomalies, they were emerging. Jung came to believe that these individuals represented an evolutionary movement within the collective psyche. Not evolution in the biological sense. Evolution in the psychological sense, a shift toward deeper self-awareness, greater shadow integration, and increased capacity for understanding human complexity. He wrote privately, "Humanity cannot progress with intellect alone. It must evolve in its capacity to perceive the unconscious." To Jung, the rare empath was the prototype of this future consciousness. They possessed the intuition to perceive patterns, the empathy to understand them, the insight to articulate them, the depth to integrate them, the restraint to navigate them, and the potential to assist others in their own psychological unfolding. But Jung also warned, the higher the development, the more catastrophic the fall if consciousness does not mature in equal measure. The dual destiny of the rare empath. According to Jung, individuals with architectural empathy stand at a crossroads from the moment their abilities awaken. They can become healers, illuminators of the unconscious, bridges between fragmented selves, catalysts for individuation, guides for psychological integration. Or they can become architects of psychological confinement, shaping others' realities according to their own wounds, fears, desires, or visions. Jung never believed this rare empath was dangerous by nature. He believed they were dangerous by potential. The rare empath, he wrote, is neither angel nor demon but the crossroads at which both paths begin. The sovereign empath, the fully integrated form. The culmination of the rare empath's evolution is what Jung called the sovereign empath, a consciousness capable of perceiving the deepest structures of the psyche without being consumed by them. The sovereign empath sees without intruding, understands without possessing, guides without controlling, questions without destabilizing, feels without drowning, mirrors without manipulating, loves without absorbing, influences without colonizing. They have mastered the art of perception and the discipline of restraint. Their power lies not in their insight but in their ethics. Jung described them as guardians of psychological becoming, witnesses of the soul who intervene only when the other seeks illumination. The rare empath's greatest task. Jung believed that the ultimate responsibility of individuals with architectural empathy was not to use their insight to shape others, but to use it to shape themselves. Their task is to integrate shadow, to embody humility, to cultivate sovereignty, to honor boundaries, to resist manipulation, to maintain authenticity, to follow the path of individuation, to transform insight into wisdom, to serve without controlling, to illuminate without overpowering. He wrote, "The rare empath must become the architect of their own psyche before they dare to approach the architecture of another." The empath is a catalyst for collective individuation. Jung's most radical idea was that humanity as a whole is undergoing a process of collective individuation. Cultures, societies, and groups are being forced to confront their own unconscious shadows. He believed that rare empaths would be essential in facilitating this process, not as leaders but as mirrors, not as authorities but as guides, not as saviors but as companions to those brave enough to confront the depths within themselves. The rare empath, Jung wrote, does not enlighten the world. They reveal the light already hidden within it. The final choice. Jung believed that each INTJ, INFJ empath faces one ultimate question. Will you use your insight to free consciousness or to bind it? The question is not trivial, it is existential. Because the rare empath holds a power that can become either the foundation of profound healing, or the blueprint of psychological imprisonment. One path leads to sovereignty, the other to corruption. Jung emphasized, awareness without humility becomes tyranny of the psyche. His final message to individuals with this rare architecture was simple, stark, and beautiful. You were not given this depth to control others. You were given it to liberate yourself, and in doing so, to illuminate a path that others may choose to walk of their own free will. The closing invocation. So if you recognize yourself in Jung's description, if you sense patterns in others before they sense them in themselves, if you read the emotional currents beneath the spoken word, if you see structures where others see chaos, if you feel the pull toward psychological truth, if you carry the burden and the gift of deep perception, then perhaps you are one of those he spoke of quietly but with reverence. The rare empath whose journey is not merely personal but evolutionary. Your task is not to reshape others. Your task is to master yourself. Your task is not to guide the many. Your task is to become whole. For when consciousness becomes whole even in one individual, the collective shifts. The rare empath does not choose the path chooses them. And the question that remains is, will you walk it as architect of imprisonment or architect of awakening? If you recognize your reflection in these depths, declare it. I see the architecture, not as a claim of power, but as a vow to wield that power with clarity, restraint, and consciousness. For your evolution is not for you alone. It is the quiet, steady expansion of human awareness itself. Thank you for walking this far. Your real journey begins now. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to breathe and remember that awareness grows when it's shared. Subscribe so you don't lose your way when the next reflection arrives. Leave a like. It helps this message reach others who need to hear it but don't yet know why. And share your thoughts below, because every comment here becomes a spark. One awakened mind helping another remember. Together, we move beyond the dark